give more returns. Get more security and more interest on your fixed deposits from Sri Lanka's largest finance company, LMDtv Finance.
To curb corruption, one must be courageous to confront and rise up against the corrupt. Sleep well, be guided by ethics and standards for peace of mind.
Refresh Sri Lanka for a civic-minded society in association with 99X. LMD, the voice of business.
Hello and welcome to LMDtv. Tonight on the forum, we have with us Suresh Shah, Director General, State-Owned Enterprises, Restructuring Unit. It's very nice to have you on the show, Suresh.
Hi, Fazmina. Pleased to be here. Pleasure.
We are seeing significant strides being made towards restructuring state-owned enterprises. Yet there also seems to be a lot of misinformation in the air. Can you give your assessment of the situation in terms of SOE restructuring in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so what you're seeing at the moment in the press is that there are certain enterprises being divested, right? But behind the scenes, there are lots of other things that are happening. So divestiture is only a component of the whole reform process around state-owned enterprises. So if I were to break this down, there would be three types of state-owned enterprises. Firstly, those enterprises that don't need to remain within government control. Then there would be a few enterprises that are really non-operational and probably need to be liquidated because they are not doing any operations. And thirdly, there are those enterprises that government may need to control over the long term. So we've got to address all. When I say we, I'm saying as a country, as a country, we need to address all these three types of entities, right? Now, the agency that we have, the State-Owned Enterprise Restructuring Unit, we are looking at only the commercial enterprises, right? And commercial being those entities that generate a revenue and are for profit. Now, they may or may not be making a profit at the moment, but they ideally should be making a profit, right? So revenue generating and ideally making a profit. So those are the enterprises that we are looking at. And there are about 130 something of those enterprises, okay? So we are trying to address all those three buckets, if I were to call it that. So those entities that government don't need to control, those entities that are no longer doing any operations and probably are better wound up. And thirdly, those entities that need to remain under government control, at least for the foreseeable future, right? So that's the role. And that's what we've been doing. And what you're seeing through the press and the media are those entities that are being divested.
Once an SOE is identified for restructuring, what happens next? Can you take us through the phase of how investors are brought on board?
Yeah, so this question is directly related to the divestiture themselves, not restructuring. So restructuring can take many forms, of which divestiture is one. But since you asked the question about investors coming on board, I'm assuming that, fundamentally you're asking about entities being divested. So there is a process that has to be followed. Cabinet will decide from time to time what entities need to be divested, okay? And then we our unit acts as the implementing agency. There is a divestiture process that has been approved by Cabinet. So we have to follow the guidelines, the divestiture guidelines, and divest the entity accordingly. So the divestiture guidelines basically speak of a two-step process. which is a EOI stage, expression of interest stage. We use the EOI stage, or let me put it this way, the EOI stage is used to shortlist prospective bidders, who will then move into the second stage, which is the RFP, or the request for proposal stage, where they will give both a technical and financial proposal, and those will be evaluated. Okay. And to assist in this entire process, the divestiture guidelines mandate that there are financial advisors appointed to assist in this whole process. Now, those financial advisors can, depending on the enterprise, they can be either international financial advisors, or they can be local, right? Financial advisors or transaction advisors. Okay. The divestiture guidelines also mandate that there are, in preparation of both the EOIs and the RFPs, and in terms of evaluating both responses to both the EOI and the RFP, the divestiture guideline mandates that those evaluations are conducted by two independent committees, independent of our unit. One is a special project committee, and the other one is a negotiating committee, right? So they are the ones that will do, they are responsible for the preparation of the EOIs and the RFPs, and to evaluate the proposals received on account of both the EOIs and the RFPs. And then the negotiating committee will be the one that makes a recommendation to cabinet, saying we got so many bidders, here is the price, here's the valuation, etc., etc., etc. They will give all the details. Based on that, the cabinet will make a decision whether they want to divest it, and to whom it should get divested to, right? So in this whole process, there are a couple of stages where cabinet gets involved. So first and foremost, cabinet gives us a kind of directive through an in-principle approval, saying these entities are identified for divestiture, now start your work. Okay. Then at the point the transaction advisors are appointed, again, the evaluation of proposals received from the transaction advisors is done by a committee which is independent to our unit, right? And then they make a recommendation to cabinet. So cabinet takes the decision in terms of who the transaction advisors are. Then subsequently, once the transaction advisors start their work, they will prepare a transaction strategy document, okay, which will say this is the way in which this transaction is best carried out. That goes to cabinet for approval. Once that approval is received, the RFP will be based on that transaction strategy. And then, of course, once the final bids come in, again, cabinet will approve. So cabinet has multiple approval points. There are two committees, like I told you earlier, independent to our unit. So we don't get involved in any of the evaluations, for example. So we have no say over, who responds to the bids, in terms of, and we don't make any recommendations in terms of, who the prospective investors are, etc. So it's a fairly comprehensive process, and there are checks and balances through the, like I said, the independent committees, then the multiple points at which cabinet has to give its consent, and so on and so forth. So it's a very transparent, credible kind of process, because at the end of the day, there have been issues around privatizations in the past, and we want to avoid all those mistakes.
Transparency is a golden word when we talk of SOA restructuring and privatization. What exactly does transparency mean in the SOA restructuring process, and how can it be ensured?
So it's about keeping different stakeholders aware of what's happening, right? We are just in the midst of planning a briefing to the press, which hopefully should happen in the next few days. So we will keep the press informed in terms of what we are doing, so that through the press, then the general public and practically all the stakeholders also will be aware. And like I told you, cabinet gets different points. At different points, cabinet is informed of how the process is being followed. We have also had discussions. Of course, I don't know whether you can say they're informal or formal, but I have met representatives of political parties. We have asked them for meetings. We've gone and met them, explained what we are doing. Similarly, trade unions have approached us and we've had conversations with them. We've explained what we are doing. So we understand that there are different stakeholders and we try to keep as many of them informed as possible.
What are the most significant advantages of restructuring SOEs in the short, mid, and long run from an economic point of view?
Yeah, so, at the end of the day, when we talk about state-owned enterprise reforms, SOE restructuring, everyone thinks that we are trying to sell stuff. That's not the ultimate aim of this. The ultimate aim is to ensure that the citizens of the country have access to good quality products and services at good pricing and at reasonable levels of availability, right? So you should have, as a citizen, you should have access to good quality products, reasonable price, and at convenient accessibility, right? So that's the ultimate aim. And then we ask ourselves, who is from an ownership perspective, who is the best owner for this, right? Is it the government or is it a private sector entity? Right now, when you make that decision, there are multiple things that you've got to consider. So, for example, from an ownership perspective, the first thing that you have to ask is this an essential product or service, right? Because if you look at the responsibilities of government, government is responsible for very, very important things like national security, like foreign policy, economic policy, education, healthcare, right? So on and so forth. And amongst these responsibilities, one of its most fundamental responsibilities is to ensure that citizens have access to essential products and services at, of a decent quality and at a decent price. Okay. So the SOEs come in at that point. It is in the provision of essential goods and services. Okay. So the first question that you have to ask yourself is a state-owned enterprise providing an essential product or service? Now, for example, we have as a SOE, right? We have the Cashew Corporation. Now, is cashew nuts an essential product or service? And the answer is no. Right? So then why does government need to, where in government's responsibility does a Cashew Corporation fit? So that's a very simple answer, right? So you don't need to have that within government. So then that's best kept under private investment. And why put it under private investment? Because if you don't put it under private investment, what happens is government has to invest in these businesses. So from an investment perspective, government is faced with many different investment requirements, right? So, for example, government needs to invest in, say, the healthcare system, right? Government needs to invest, for example, in the education system, okay? Now, so if we take a very, very small example, well, it's not really a small example, although from a rupees and cents perspective, it might be. We have a number of girls' schools outside of Colombo, outside of the Colombo district probably, which don't have proper toilets. There are classrooms which don't have proper walls. So now, will a private sector, is it easy to find investors to go and build a toilet in a girls' school? Is it easy to find investors who will go and build walls in a school, right? The answer is no. But will you find investors easily to invest in a commercial enterprise which gives you a profit? And the answer is yes. Okay. So when you have options of having other people invest in certain things, you give them the space, you give them the opportunity and say, look, you put your money in those activities, whilst we will put our money, and we meaning government, we will put our money into places where others are not interested in investing. Now, because all of us have limited resources, right? Nobody has unlimited resources. So it's about how government best utilizes its limited resources. Okay. Another example is in healthcare. Now, today, if you take an underprivileged farmer who's, let's say, living in Girandrukote, for example, okay. Now, he has a heart attack and needs heart surgery. He's going to have to wait for 6 months because of a lack of hospital beds, because of a lack of facilities, because of a lack of doctors. Okay. Now, this is where government needs to invest its money, right? In providing those essential services and goods at times, right? Where others are not willing to invest. Okay. But if there are others who are willing to invest, okay, and give the citizens the right products and services at a decent quality, at a affordable price, then let others invest in those. And as government, you reserve your funds, you keep your funds back to invest into areas where others are not interested in investing, but which are essential for citizens of the country, right? So this is the fundamental principle on which a decision needs to be taken as to whether an enterprise needs to remain within government or not. Okay, so there are other considerations. So for example, you can ask the private sector to provide certain products and services which are essential in nature. But if it is only one private enterprise that is willing to, say, take the risk, okay, then it becomes a monopoly, and monopoly is not a good thing from a consumer perspective. So then you ask yourself the question: can we regulate that industry? Can we put a regulator and ensure that consumer interests are met, whilst allowing the investor to make a reasonable return on his investment, right? So there are different mechanisms which government can use, okay, to get private sector to invest in certain areas, and B, to protect the interests of the consumer or the citizen.
And what are the risks and challenges, and how are they being mitigated?
I think the risks and challenges, the first risk stems from the fact that, people have this massive misunderstanding about these state-owned enterprises, right? Over the years, I think the citizens of Sri Lanka have been brainwashed with this story about these being our national assets and need to remain within government and should not be privatized. And I think that's a big challenge and a big risk to overcome. Okay, people really no one's really gone out there and tried to explain to people and said, look, like I was just explaining to you, right? And I could see that you were also thinking through this while I was speaking to you, right? So I think the lack of real knowledge is a serious risk, and it's a serious challenge. Unfortunately, that lack of knowledge, or I can even say people have been misled by politicians, because I think they've spun a narrative to suit their political purposes, unfortunately, and as a result, people have been misled, and the country has got into serious trouble as a result of that. But because people have been brainwashed, that's a serious challenge. Then, of course, there are entrenched interests in all of these things. When these assets get privatized, there are certain stakeholders that may not be able to extract benefits out of those assets. Okay, and that can be at both the bureaucracy level as well as the political level. And then there is an election that will probably come sometime next year, and depending on who wins, who loses, you don't know what will happen to the reform program. And I'm not just talking about state-owned enterprise reforms, but reforms in general. So these are the real risks that we face. But I think that the fact that the Sri Lankan population has over so many years been brainwashed about some of these things with the wrong narrative is, I think, the biggest problem, and that not only in state-owned enterprise reform, but I think in the entire reform process.
It's time to take a short break. When we return, we'll get back to the state-owned enterprises.
Display your brand message on digital screens at prime locations. The largest digital advertising network in Sri Lanka. Emerging Media.
You're mobile, and so are we.
Gets me going.
Grab the Lite 87 app at the Apple App Store or Google Play now.
87.8 and 87.6 island-wide. Lite 87.
Welcome back to the show. We've been talking with the Director General, State-Owned Enterprises Restructuring Unit, Suresh Shah. What is your assessment of the political will behind Sri Lanka's SOE restructuring strategy?
Very difficult to figure out. We've been, as a country, we've been painted into a corner. And so there are certain things as a country that we just simply have to do, right? And again, I'm not applying this only to the state-owned enterprise reforms but I'm saying this on account of all reforms. So that again brings me to the another challenge. Once things settle down, and when people start getting comfortable, and that includes all stakeholders, right? It can be you and me as individuals. It can be the private sector. I can see the private sector getting comfortable even now. The politicians start to get comfortable. We can have the entire reform process taking a different turn. And we've seen this in the past, because if you think about it, we've had 17 IMF programs in 75 years. And if the first reform process was successful, we wouldn't need the other 16. So we have gone through this cycle many, many times in this country. So we've started on reforms, people have got comfortable, the reforms have been then sidelined, then we fall into trouble again, then we go back to the IMF, we do a few reforms, then again we get comfortable, and then again the reforms get sidelined. So we've had this history of going into reforms, comfort levels improving, and then sacrificing the reforms because we think now everything is fine. And then again, we fall into trouble, and then again, we go back to the IMF. So that's why 17 times and over 75 years, which is once every 4.5 years on average.
An evil cycle, I said.
Well, it's a cycle. Honestly, I don't blame the IMFs of this world. I think we got to do what's right for ourselves, and we got to know what's right. I'm whether in our private life or whether in the private sector, at the end of the day, we do what we believe is right? Yes, of course, there are times when we ask people for advice. In the private sector, we appoint consultants and all of that. But at the end of the day, they advise, we take the decision. Okay, and we do it on the basis of what's good for all the stakeholders. Unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, we have this habit of saying we are doing this because the IMF says we need to do it. And I think I can't agree. I don't agree with that. I think we need to do things because we believe it's right for us.
And what is your message and advice to prospective investors looking at buying SOEs?
So I think Sri Lanka has an enormous amount of potential. It's got its own challenges. I think every country has its own challenges. We've got things some of which are common across the globe, and in certain instances which are unique. But we've been a resilient economy, and I think there is hope for many, many businesses because the level of penetration of goods and services in the country is actually quite low. So there is, notwithstanding the the fact that we've had a difficult economic time, etc., and that's all true. But when you look at it at the micro organization level, I think there is incredible potential to grow businesses in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka being a country that needs a very strong export sector, although we don't have it at the moment, I think from an economic development perspective, we absolutely need a very strong export sector. A lot of Sri Lankan entities will end up being decent exporters in the medium to long term. So the Sri Lankan market is not just Sri Lanka, but I think it's It's all those countries with whom we sign trade agreements, for example, free trade agreements. So we should never look at Sri Lanka from the perspective of 22 million people, but we need to look at it from, where do we have trade agreements, free trade agreements particularly? What's the potential in those areas? How can we create Sri Lanka as a hub to supply all those markets?
Some months back, you mentioned that Sri Lanka's national assets were our human capital, youth talent, and natural capital, and not SOEs. To ensure successful SOE privatization and restructuring, how should Sri Lanka harness the power of our national assets, focusing mainly on our talent?
So I did say that they are not these SOEs, but our real assets are particularly the youth, and there are a few other things as well. So how I define a national asset is an asset that can be leveraged to transform the country, right? And when I look at any single commercial enterprise, whether they are state-owned or whether they are privately owned, I don't believe that there is any commercial enterprise that can transform a nation. I mean, in the large scheme of things, these commercial enterprises are of less relevance. So the real assets, the assets that can transform a nation, is our human capital, and particularly our younger generation. It's the ocean that surrounds us. It's we have a very fertile soil in this country. You plant something and that grows without too much of hassle. That's a serious national asset that we have. Then if you take the whole tank network that we have, where we store rainwater and feed it to the last acre of a farmer's land. That's an incredible irrigation system. That's something we need to harness to transform our country. Now, that is a national asset. If you look at the Sri Lanka's location, we are 10 nautical miles away from the world's busiest sea route, right? Everything that goes to China from the west goes past Sri Lanka, and everything from China that goes to the west also goes past Sri Lanka. So it's and as we know, Asia is the emerging continent. So that's a huge, our location is a huge national asset. Then also, I think the environment that we have, we have although it's raining at the moment, most times of the year we have a lot of sunshine, and that's something that can be harnessed, right? From an energy perspective, the ocean around us, our waterways can be harnessed for hydro energy, so hydro-powered energy, and then also there is this new evolution on green hydrogen and all of that. So these are the real national assets that we have. You asked me the specific question about the human talent. I think first and foremost, we need to figure out how to retain our human talent. There is fairly substantial migration happening. So we need to create better living standards in our country. And that talks about economic development. It talks about social development. It talks about creating a more liberal and a more accommodating society. People shouldn't fear because I come from a particular part of the country, or because I come from a particular religion, or because I come from a particular community. I shouldn't have fear. We need to celebrate our diversity, right? So these are the ways in which we need to retain our talent, give them the right opportunities, the right conditions, so that they can make a decent life for themselves. I'm not talking about giving people subsidies, but I'm talking about giving people the opportunity to create a better life for themselves, right? Better paying jobs and so on and so forth. So we need to have that in place. Then, of course, we need to have a good education system. Now, Sri Lanka's education system has been hailed in the past as being one of the best, but it is now a dated system. The entire system is based not on knowledge, but on cramming for exams, okay? I don't know whether the curriculums are up to date in our schools. We don't have basic facilities in our schools. Like I was telling you earlier, there are some schools which don't have toilets, some schools which don't have proper classrooms, lots of schools don't have the proper science labs, and so on and so forth. So our entire education system probably needs a fairly significant overhaul. And then we need to, so one is the infrastructure, and then the curriculum of the education system needs to focus on the emerging technologies. So our people need to learn about what's going to drive the world in the next 25 years, rather than what made Sri Lanka great over the last 250 years or the last 1,000 years. I mean, it's good to know our history and it's good to know our culture, but history and culture are not going to give us a livelihood, right? That's something we can be proud of and we can take pride in, but it's not going to improve our living standards. So we got to focus on that side as well. So these are some of the things we need to focus on when it comes to the younger generation. And I think very, very, very importantly, every generation is more open than the previous one, right? And technology is helping in that process. So people are much more broader in their outlook and in their thinking. They have access to information that happens in other parts of the world, to news that happens, what happens in the US, we will get to know if it's something important, we'll know the next minute, right? So in this environment, we need to create societies that are open and societies that are actually, for me, tolerance is not sufficient. It's what I said earlier. We need to celebrate our diversity and take pride in that, because that diversity brings different thoughts to the table, different ideas to the table. And when you have that diversity of thinking, when you have the diversity of outlook, the outcome is always much better. I mean, it's very simple. You think about a room, let's say with 1,000 people, and let's say every one of them is dressed in the same color. That's boring, right? Whereas think about the same 1,000 people dressed in different types of clothes, different colors, right? Speaking different languages. I mean, it's a much more exciting and a much more alive place to be. So it's that kind of thinking and concept that we need to translate. So we need to get people to start believing that this is the country in which they need to live, create opportunities for themselves, and then that helps transform the country.
LMD's campaign titled Refresh Sri Lanka was launched to encourage a mindset change for a more civic-minded society. What are your focus areas to ensure that civic-mindedness is upheld during SOE privatization and restructuring so that the end consumer, the general public, would benefit?
So this thing about being civic-minded, I fully agree. At the end of the day, we need to be all civic-minded. But when you think of people who are, it's easy maybe for you and me to talk about civic-mindedness because we have the things that we want, right? And the challenges for us from that, okay, yeah, sure, cost of living may go up, but we can still manage, okay? But when there is someone who's like underprivileged, can't meet the expenses that they need to meet, doesn't have a proper roof over their head, have 2 children who they need to feed, clothe, send to school, their first thought is going to be, how are we going to get these kids to school? How are we going to feed them? How are we going to clothe them? So it's tough to be civic-minded when you have serious personal challenges, because your focus is very different. So I think that's an important aspect that we need to understand, right? I'm not trying to make excuses, but this is a reality. Okay, so even from that perspective, I think the more developed countries in the world are more civic-minded because the population actually has the space and the time, right, to be more civic-minded. Okay, their situation in life doesn't push them to think selfishly. In countries like ours, it's different, right? So you've got to give some space for these people. In terms of the SOE reform process, I think it goes back to what I said earlier, that we've been brainwashed. Okay, now we've got to get people to unlearn. Unfortunately, this brainwashing process is at least 25 to 30 years long, right? So for us to get them to unlearn some of the things that they've been fed with over the last 25 or 30 years is not easy. Actually, probably more than 30 years, I would think. So to get them to unlearn, okay, those things that have been kind of force-fed into their brain over this really long period of time, to get them to unlearn that in 6 months is a tough call. We are trying, but it's not an easy task. So let's see.
Any closing thoughts you would like to share with our audience?
Sure. So I keep saying this. I'm probably getting boring now. So at the end of the day, I mean, we've got to, as Sri Lankans, we've got to understand one thing. It's 75 years since independence. And after 75 years, we've hit a truly difficult economic period, right? I mean, the word that has been used for Sri Lanka is bankrupt, and it has been used by our own politicians as well, right? In some deep economic trouble. We've had two types of civil wars in this country. One which was fundamentally between or linked to two communities, let me say, and then there was also a youth uprising on two occasions. And then we've had trouble between communities on and off during the 75-year period. So basically, when you look back, the fundamental message that comes through is the way that we have run this country over the past 75 years is not the right one. And then, of course, to top it all up, we've gone to the IMF 17 times, once every 4.5 years on average. So all these are indications that, and then, the massive migration that is taking place now. So this tells you that Sri Lanka has not been governed well. So if we want to change these things, if we want to live peacefully amongst ourselves, have hope for the future, get opportunities for better life, for a better standard of living for our people, if our kids are to be better educated, if they are to stay back in Sri Lanka, if we are to leverage on our true national assets for transformation, we have to do things differently than what we've done in the past 75 years. I mean, this is the very fundamental truth. And like Albert Einstein once said, the definition of insanity is when you keep repeating what you have done in the past, but expect a different result in the future. So we have to change. And those changes are the reforms that we need to do. Now, at this moment in time, we are addressing economic reforms. Okay, but the way I see it, and I may be wrong, I'm not an economist, so I could be very wrong, is the economic catastrophe that Sri Lanka faced is not because we don't know economics, but it's because our governance systems are very poor. So my real message is that unless we resolve our governance issues, okay, and unless we correct our governance systems, our governance structures, our governance processes, the economic reforms that we are doing will take us only so far and not beyond. If we really want to transform Sri Lanka, whilst we are addressing the economic reform process, we have to address the governance processes as well, the governance reforms. Right? I think that it is more important to do the governance reforms because that will lead to better economics in any case. So I think it's much more important that we focus on the governance reforms than on the economic reforms. That really is my final message.
It's been lovely having you on the show.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
And to our viewers, until next time, take care.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching and stay safe.